Hi students, and welcome to chapter 18, which will be on the urinary system. We just have a couple chapters left before the end of the semester. So the urinary system is the main excretory system of the body. Some organs and other systems also will eliminate wastes like your digestive tract, but they are not able to compensate in the case of kidney failure. So here, what are the organs that make up your urinary system? Simply put, your urinary system, especially in the kidneys, will filter all the blood in the body and take out anything bad or toxic or different electrolytes in the blood, and they are excreted out of the body as urine. So here are the kidneys. Kidneys create the urine, which is the waste products formed from filtering the blood, and that travels through the ureters, which brings the urine to be stored in the urinary bladder until it's ready to be excreted through the urethra out of the body. The functions of the urinary system are excretion of wastes, regulation of blood volume and blood pressure. You have different cells in your urinary system that we'll talk about that help to regulate blood volume and blood pressure if it were to drop suddenly. Regulation of blood solute concentration in terms of sodium, potassium, water, regulation of extracellular fluid pH levels, regulation of red blood cell synthesis. So your kidneys create erythropoietin, which is the hormone necessary for making red blood cells, and also the regulation of vitamin D synthesis. So we all have two kidneys, two ureters, which will connect the kidneys to one urinary bladder and then one urethra that takes the urine out of the body. And this is just kind of a little kind of synopsis of the urinary system and the anatomy of everything and where it's located. So feel free to pause the slide and take a good look at this. We'll also review these structures in lab. So kidney characteristics, they are bilateral retroperitoneal organs, meaning they lie in the kind of the back of your body, by your back. They're bean-shaped. They weigh about 5 ounces, which is about the bar of a soap, or the size of a fist, and they're located between the 12th thoracic and the 3rd lumbar vertebrae. There's a renal capsule, which is the connective tissue surrounding each kidney. It protects it and acts as a barrier. The hilum is the indentation in the kidney bean shape that contains the renal artery, veins, nerves, and ureter that enter and exit the body. The renal sinus contains the renal pelvis, blood vessels, and fat. And then the renal cortex is the outer, lighter colored layer of the kidneys. And the renal medulla is the deeper inner portion of the kidneys. The renal pyramids are a junction between the cortex and the medulla. A calyx is the tip of the pyramids, and the renal pelvis is where all the calyxes join together in kind of like a funneling system that funnel all the urine that's formed to form the ureter out of the kidney. So here's a look at the renal capsule, the outer connective tissue layer, the cortex. The medulla is the inner layer with these renal pyramids all connecting to a calyx. And the calyxes all will funnel urine that's formed to this middle portion called the renal pelvis. And the renal pelvis exits or funnels the urine out of the kidney as the ureter. The nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. Each kidney has over 1 million of these. There are 2 types of the nephrons. About 15% are juxtamedullary, and the nephron includes always the renal corpuscle where the filtration of blood occurs, and then the proximal tubule, loop of Henle, distal tubule, and collecting duct are all where absorption or secretion of different electrolytes occurs. The renal corpuscle is the structure that contains a Bowman's capsule and glomerulus. The Bowman's capsule is the enlarged end of a nephron. It opens into the proximal tubule, and it contains specific podocytes, which are specialized cells that surround the glomerular capillaries that have slits in between them that allow different filtrate to pass through. The glomerulus itself contains capillaries wrapped around it. You can see here, here's a look at the glomerulus, these capillaries, and we kind of zoom in on what makes up the glomerulus with these specific podocyte cells. They have these little slits in between their feet, the filtration slits that allow for blood substances to be filtered through them. And here's kind of a zoomed out version of the glomerular capsule or the renal corpuscle, with the afferent arteriole bringing blood into it to be filtered and the efferent arteriole bringing blood out. The filtrate that's formed after traveling through the podocytes will travel through the proximal convoluted tubule, through the loop of Henle, through the distal convoluted loop, or distal convoluted tubule, and into the central collecting duct. The filtration membrane in the nephron is in the renal corpuscle, and it includes the glomerular capillaries, the podocytes, and the basement membrane. The filtrate itself is the fluid that passes across that filtration membrane from the blood. The proximal tubule is where the filtrate passes first. The loop of Henle contains descending and ascending loops. Water and solutes will pass through the thin walls by diffusion. And the distal tubule is the structure between the loop of Henle and the collecting duct. The collecting duct will empty into all the calyxes, and again, all the calyxes will carry fluid from the cortex through the medulla. So here's a look at the nephron, the renal corpuscle, again, where blood goes into and out of it, where the filtering occurs. That filtrate will travel through the proximal convoluted tubule, down and up the loop of Henle, into the distal convoluted tubule, and into the central collecting duct. You can see here how there's several collecting ducts that will empty into kind of a calyx to eventually get the urine out into the ureter. The flow of filtrate through the nephron goes through the renal corpuscle, through the proximal loop, and through these next steps that I do want you guys to know, this general order of the flow of filtrate through the nephron. The blood flow through the kidney. This is also important to know. This is, so the renal artery brings blood into the kidney, and then the renal vein will bring blood out of the kidney. But these are all the branches of the renal arteries and the renal veins and how they travel through the kidney, eventually bringing blood into the glomerulus and then out of the glomerulus and out through the vein. And here it takes a look, and it's numbered 1 through 12, I believe, or through 13, and it's just a really good indication of how blood gets into the kidney and where it gets filtered. So through the renal artery, through these interlobular arteries, through the arcuate arteries, interlobular arteries, eventually into the afferent arterioles, which bring blood into the glomerulus, out of the glomerulus as the efferent arterioles. Then the arteries will travel around kind of the tubular system to absorb any other substances that come out of the filtrate, and eventually the blood makes its way out as the arcuate vein and out of the kidney as the renal vein. Urine formation involves these processes: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. Filtration occurs in the renal corpuscle. The reabsorption is involved in removing substances from the filtrate and placing them back into the blood. Secretion involves taking substances from the blood at a nephron area other than the renal corpuscle and putting it back into the nephron tubule. So here's a look at what happens during filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion, and I'll let you read through those on your own a little bit as you're reviewing that. Urine formation, filtration, the movement of water, ions, small molecules through the filtration membrane go into the Bowman's capsule. About 19% of plasma becomes the filtrate, and 180 liters of filtrate are produced by the nephrons each day, and 1% of the filtrate, about 1.8 liters, become urine. The rest will always be absorbed. Only small molecules are passed through the filtration membrane. The formation of filtrate depends on filtration pressure, and the pressure forces fluid across the filtration membrane, and this pressure is influenced by blood pressure. So here's a look at filtration pressure. Again, this is showing how blood enters and exits the glomerulus and how this increase in pressure forces filtrate across the membrane into the capsular space and through the proximal convoluted tubule. 99% of filtrate will be reabsorbed and will re-enter the blood circulation, and the proximal tubule will be the primary site for reabsorption of solutes and water. The descending loop of Henle will concentrate the filtrate, And the reabsorption of water and solutes from the distal tubule and collecting duct will always be controlled by hormones. And this takes you through several steps that just kind of talk you through the reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule. Urine concentration, the descending loop is where is a critical site for water reabsorption, where urine is concentrated. So the filtrate leaving the proximal convoluted tubule at this point will be more concentrated as it passes through the descending loop of Henle, and the mechanism for this water reabsorption will be osmosis. The renal medulla, that layer in the kidney, will contain very concentrated interstitial fluid that has large amounts of sodium chloride and urea, and the wall of the thin segment is highly permeable to water, so as filtrate moves through the medulla containing a highly concentrated interstitial fluid, water will naturally be reabsorbed out of the nephron by osmosis, and the water will then enter the vasa recta. The ascending loop of Henle dilutes the filtrate by removing solutes. The thin segment of the ascending limb is not permeable to water, but it is permeable to solutes, and consequently solutes will diffuse out of the nephron. So here is kind of the urine concentrating mechanism that you guys can read through the steps on your own, just to see where solutes pass in and out and where water passes in and out to try to concentrate the urine even more. The reabsorption is often happened in the loop of Henle to try to concentrate the urine more. So this just shows solutes being diffused back either into the blood by osmosis or back into the filtrate to concentrate it. And the distal convoluted tubule showing the collecting duct reabsorption as well. So eventually we get to urine production and secretion. So tubular secretion removes some substances from the blood. These substances include byproducts of metabolism that become toxic in high concentrations and drugs or other molecules not normally produced by the body. Tubular secretion occurs through either active or passive mechanisms. Ammonia secretion is passive, and secretion of the hydrogen ions, potassium, creatinine, histamine, and penicillin is by active transport. These substances will be then actively transported into the nephron, and the secretion of hydrogen ions will play a very important role in regulating the body fluid pH. There's three major hormonal mechanisms that are involved in regulating urine concentration and volume. The RAA system is the Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone system, antidiuretic hormone, and then atrial natriuretic hormone that comes from the heart. So the RAA system, renin, which is produced by kidney cells, will act on angiotensinogen to produce angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is eventually converted to angiotensin 2, and angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction if blood pressure or blood volume needs to rise. Angiotensin 2 also acts on the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, and aldosterone will increase the rate of active transport of sodium back into the distal tubules and the collecting duct, so the volume of water in urine will decrease. So this just takes a look at aldosterone actions. Increased aldosterone secretion will increase sodium and water reabsorption, which will result in increased blood pressure. Antidiuretic hormone acts on kidneys, causing them to absorb more water, so that also decreases urine volume, and the result is to maintain a normal blood volume and blood pressure for antidiuretic hormone. And then atrial natriuretic hormone, it's secreted from cardiac muscle when blood pressure increases, and ANH will act on the kidneys to help to decrease sodium reabsorption, so sodium ions will remain in the nephron to become urine, and increased loss of sodium and water will reduce blood volume and blood pressure. So this is the body's way to try to decrease blood pressure and decrease blood volume by releasing ANP from the cardiac muscle cells in the heart. So this takes you through some of the homeostatic controls of blood volume from these two different hormones, whether it's antidiuretic hormone or ANP, and I'll let you guys read through those on your own. The ureters and urinary bladder. The ureters are the small tubes, again, that carry urine from the renal pelvis to the bladder. The urinary bladder is in the pelvic cavity. It stores urine. It can hold a few milliliters to a maximum of 1,000 milliliters. The urethra is the tube that exits the bladder. It carries urine from the urinary bladder to outside of the body. And this just takes you through some of the anatomy of the kidney, the ureter, the bladder, which has this trigone-shaped triangular structure, kind of from the openings of the ureter to the opening of the urethra. And the location of the external urethral sphincter, that's what is under voluntary control that you guys can control when you expel the urine. The Micturition reflex is activated by a stretch of the urinary bladder wall. Action potentials are conducted from the bladder to the spinal cord, and parasympathetic action causes the bladder to contract. The stretching of the bladder will stimulate sensory neurons to inform the brain that the person needs to urinate. So this is an involuntary response due to the parasympathetic system. But again, what is a voluntary response, because you're probably thinking, well, I control the need when I urinate, is the external urethral sphincters under voluntary control. Intracellular fluid compartment includes the fluid inside all of the cells of the body. Approximately 2/3 of all the water in the body is in the intracellular fluid compartment, and the extracellular fluid compartment includes all the fluid outside of the cells. The extracellular fluid compartment includes interstitial fluid, plasma, other special fluids like joint and cerebrospinal fluid. The composition of these fluids, they have a lot of different ions: potassium, magnesium, phosphate, sulfate. It has a lower concentration of sodium, calcium chloride, in this bicarbonate ion than does the extracellular fluid. And the cell membranes that separate the body fluid compartments will be selectively permeable. Water continually passes through them, but ions dissolved in the water do not readily pass through them. Water movement is regulated mainly by hydrostatic pressure differences and osmotic differences, and osmosis controls the movement of water between the intracellular and extracellular spaces. The regulation of the extracellular fluid composition is due to thirst regulation and also ion concentration. Thirst regulation, water intake will be controlled by the thirst center, as I'm taking a drink of water, located in the hypothalamus. And when the concentration of ions in the blood increases, it stimulates the thirst center to cause thirst. And when water is consumed, the concentrations of blood ions will decrease. Due to a dilution effect, this causes the sensation of thirst to decrease. So that is the thirst regulation due to the hypothalamus. Ion concentration regulation, regulating the concentrations of positively charged ions like sodium, potassium, and calcium is very important because action potentials, muscle contraction, and all the cell membrane permeability depend on the maintenance of a narrow range of these concentrations. Chloride ions are secondarily regulated by the mechanisms that control the positively charged ions, and the negatively charged ions will be attracted to the positively charged ions. When the positively charged ions will be transported, the negatively charged ions will often move with them. Sodium ions are the dominant ions. About 90 to 95% of osmotic pressure of the extracellular fluid results from sodium ions and from the negative ions associated with them. And stimuli that control aldosterone secretion will often influence the reabsorption of sodium back into the body. And sodium ions are also excreted in sweat. Potassium ions, the electrically excitable tissues such as muscles and nerves, are very sensitive to slight changes in potassium concentration. So the extracellular concentration of potassium must be maintained within a narrow range for these tissues to function normally. Aldosterone plays a major role in regulating the concentration of potassium in the extracellular fluid. And here is the regulation of blood potassium levels and how it changes with different disturbances in the homeostasis. Calcium ions, their concentration is maintained within a narrow range A slight increase or decrease in their concentration will have a dramatic effect on the electrical properties of excitable tissues. PTH and calcitonin are two hormones. PTH increases extracellular calcium concentrations, and calcitonin will reduce blood calcium levels when it is too high. Calcitonin, again, tones down blood calcium levels. Phosphate and sulfate will be reabsorbed by active transport back into the kidneys. The rate of reabsorption is slow, and as long as the concentration of these ions is low, nearly all of them will be reabsorbed by active transport. And then we'll talk about the regulation of acid-base balance. So we'll talk about buffers, which are chemicals that resist a change in pH of a solution. Buffers in the body contain salts of weak acids or bases that combine with hydrogen ions. And you have three classes of buffers: proteins, phosphate buffers, or bicarbonate buffers. The respiratory system is also involved in the acid-base balance. It will rapidly respond to changes in pH. Increased respiratory rate, so more breathing, will raise the blood pH. So make it more basic or alkalotic due to increased rate of carbon dioxide elimination. And reduced respiratory rate reduces pH, making it more acidic due to the decreased rate of carbon dioxide elimination from the body. The kidney involvement in this balance, the nephrons will secrete hydrogen ions into the urine to directly help regulate the pH of body fluids. More hydrogen secretion happens if the pH is decreasing, and less hydrogen secretion happens if the pH is increasing. And this takes you through the regulation of acid-base balance of the pH. Acidosis and alkalosis. Acidosis means the blood is too acidic, and this will occur when the pH of the blood falls below 7.35. There are two types of acidosis: respiratory and metabolic. Alkalosis occurs when the pH of the blood increases above 7.45, and there are two types of alkalosis based upon the cause: respiratory and metabolic. And that takes us through kind of the acid bases and balances. We just have 2 more chapters to get through that I will combine into one lecture. I hope you guys are all staying healthy and well, and take care.